Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Scott Stedman podcast. Hope you had a wonderful week. I know in Ohio it has been freezing to the point where my kids have not had school, and Micah had experienced a some pipes bursting in his home and had been cleaning it up, which has kind of prevented him from being on this episode of the Scott Stedman. So today, I was actually thinking about doing a throwback to a segment I used to do before Micah joined, and it's been a long time since I've done one of these, but I'm going to be talking about a film for thought. And if you're unfamiliar with what a film for thought is, it's basically looking at a movie and kind of pulling some of the central themes out of it, maybe some of the underlying themes or the main themes of a movie, and even kind of how does that reflect to our own faith journey. So the movie I'm going to talk about today is 2024's Nosferatu, directed by Robert Eggers. This movie, Nosferatu, is so fantastic. And if you know me personally for years, you know that I got into the horror genre really late. My parents wouldn't allow me to watch horror films. It wasn't until I got my first DVD player, my senior year in high school, was when I actually um, started to really dive into horror, mainly because of the startup company out on the West Coast called Netflix was mailing DVDs. So I signed up for a free trial, and then I was seeing how many horror films were there, and the world was my oyster. But probably one of the horror films that I would consider a classic, one of my favorite, is F.W. Marnau's 1920s Nosferatu. And I liked that film, Marnau's vision for that, because it was really cool to learn about German Expressionism as an art form and just kind of the play with lights and shadows, and how that the play of light and shadows was kind of a big underlying motif of how it communicated within the bigger story of that movie. Um, and especially with the in the age of DVDs, it wasn't just like, oh, you could watch the movie. Hey, here's a commentary track, or here's a historian kind of talking about it. I can remember watching Nosferatu from beginning to end, and then going back and listening to this guy talk about teaching me about German expressions and tell me what was happening in the movie. And it was so fascinating because with the way the silent actors did certain things, how they moved their bodies, how they moved their hands, how the light and shadow, and how Marnau captured all of that. Really, you kind of hit on a lot of great themes of sexuality, lust, and relationships, and how that all, especially when left unchecked, how that can lead to ruin. And um and I just thought that was so fascinating. So when I walked in to see Eggard's take on Nosferatu, um, I had a pretty high bar, because since Nosferatu was my favorite film, this one wasn't going to live up to Marnau's vision and expectations. And oh my goodness, this was probably went above and beyond my expectations. Not only did this film really capture some of those same thematic elements that was in Marnau's original, but Edgar's did something great where he took that same concept and kind of elevated it and kind of showed different layers to it, which made it more timely for a modern day audience, which is, you know, I think for a lot is very hard to do. And I believe Edgar's nailed it. Like everything about this film, from the way it was filmed, shot, the cinematography, the lighting, every single performer that was in this movie played their part to perfection. I mean, Lily Rose Depp was great, Bill Skarsgård was great, William Dafoe was great, Nicholas Hoult was great, Aaron Taylor Johnson was great, Emma Corrin was great, even Simon McBurney, who played Knock, which Knock is one of those characters which in the original didn't really get was great, but didn't really get a lot of screen time, didn't really get a lot of love. So just seeing more of Knock and how they played that, like, oh my gosh, like Simon McBurney, I don't know if you will listen to the Scott Summit podcast, probably not. Your portrayal of Knock was so good. It was so good. Loved it. But yeah, so let's now that you've heard me obsess about this movie, let's talk about some of the themes. So, like I've said before, Marnau's version of it really played a lot on sensuality and sexuality was kind of its big motif, where in the original you kind of see this relationship, but then of course the main character, which again, it's been so long since I've seen Marnau's Nosferatu, so I can't remember the names anymore. Um, where he goes, he meets Count Orlok, and you kind of see how even though he says he loves his wife, his newly married bride, that's not entirely the case. Just the way that actor would portray certain body movements, certain things. Like you kind of saw that, yes, I'm married to this woman, but I'm not going to give her what she needs. And, you know, a thing is sexuality can kind of be portrayed in movies as something perverse, but at least in the original Marnau film, which again, censorship was really high in the 20s. The fact that sensuality and sexuality was kind of used as intimacy, like a closeness. So the fact that this desire of being with somebody, um, you saw that the main female protagonists connected with Count Orlok because Orlok desired her. And even though she desired her husband, he was not able to give her what he needed, right? So that theme plays out in Eggert's version too. Ellen Hunter and Thomas Hutter are newly married. Thomas is working for Knock, and Knock is sending Thomas away to Count Orlok because apparently Count Orlok wants to move into London. Now, Count Orlok, in some ways, the way I've kind of interpret Orlok's character is that sense of desire. And we kind of know a little bit more backstory that Ellen kind of almost has this supernatural relationship with Orlok. Um, and, you know, that could, and I mean, I think a lot of people can interpret that in a lot of different ways. But I think kind of again using the 1920s version as a foundation, I think that there was this almost this suppression of sexuality from Ellen Hunter, who has struggled and have dealt with her own sexuality and expressing that, um, to the point where even though she's married now and she has the opportunity to express her sexuality within the bounds of marriage, again, trying to build a better life, trying to work to make money so we can live in a bigger house, actually start a family, not live in a one-bedroom apartment, which is kind of the main reason why Thomas goes across countries to go sign to work on this deal to Count Orlok to get that commission that can kind of go and help her, which, you know, there's this great scene where when Thomas is finally back after kind of being locked in Orlok's castle and was finally able to return home to Ellen, you know, there's this conflict, there's this fight where she's mad at him and saying, "You sold me for money." Meaning that, you took advantage of our love, you took advantage of our relationship because you weren't here to take care of my needs because you wanted to make money to have a better life, which, I mean, in some ways, that's very much some of the challenges in our current relationships in 2024. There's always that there's something to be said about the pursuit of trying to build a home, build a family, and the challenges and the pressures, especially in a culture that is always communicating that you always have to have more. It's having a lifestyle is very excessive. And if you continue to keep chasing that trail, you're just going to work yourself to the bone and you may not never achieve the type of life you want. So in a way, instead of trying to climb the corporate ladder or to chase the cash cow and putting all your time and effort and love into that, what about the relationships and the people around you? And I think that's a very big theme too. The other big theme that I loved about this movie is every single scene in this movie was dark. Even the daylight scenes always had clouds over them. They were very dark. Like there was like it's when you're watching this movie, everything is very dimly lit. And and that's a reason. And there's a good reason for that because that's the whole purpose that, you know, there's kind of a dark cloud over everybody. Like every single character in this movie is a flawed character. Even the main female protagonist, Ellen Hutter, who ends up kind of becoming the main heroine for this whole film. But even that has a shroud of darkness. But then how Nosferatu adds to the whole vampire lore is this is the first time where we see daylight be kind of an antagonist to vampires. So, in a way for Ellen to save her husband and to kind of save her community from this massive plague that is running rampant through her community, she kind of opens herself up to Count Orlok. And she calls him late in the night. She gives herself to Count Orlok. And then Count Orlok dies because he's still with Ellen while the sun's rising. And that's the only time in the movie where we actually see a very strong lighting scheme. Is at the very end when the sun rises, the clouds have broken, the sun's shining through, and Count Orlok dies due to sunlight. But in the process, Ellen also dies too. Spoiler alert. Um, but again, if you watch the original Nosferatu, you kind of know it's coming. And I think a lot of times what that could mean thematically is, Ellen's a tortured soul because she's keeping a secret, a dark secret, and she doesn't want to communicate that secret because it's so taboo in her culture and her society today. And yet, what we can kind of see is if we're able to talk about our struggles, we talk about the things that are haunting us, talk about the burdens or maybe the sins that we carry. If we're able to share that and bring that to light, that's where we can see those things, that's when we can start to see the vanquish of evil, the vanquish of that burden in our lives. Now, I say all that because I think of the scriptures where um, where it says, "Bear one another's burdens as you fulfill the law of Christ." And I love that passage so much because I feel like a lot of times when people are struggling, they don't want to say because there's that fear of judgment, especially within religion, especially within the church. There's that fear of, well, if I share this sin or the struggle I have, I'm going to get kicked out of the church, which is a close knit, which is a community that I'm a part of. People are going to think of me differently. People are going to judge me. And never once do we think, if I share the struggles with these group of people that I call my church home, my family, my fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, then maybe healing can come from that. And yet, in churches, we don't necessarily see that because the church has a bad rap of when people come confess about some of their struggles, it never comes to healing. It always leads to shame, which pushes, again, it's like I want to reveal this ugly thing to light so it can be vanquished. And yet the church is saying that's bad, and we push it further down in the chest and we want to shut and lock it, which causes more damage than good. Even when we look at just kind of, Mike and I, um, for most of our career, through the Scott Stedman podcast, I mean, we've talked a lot about church scandals and pastors doing things and uncovered abuses and certain things within the churches. And a lot of that always comes because they weren't able to come clean. They had to hide it. And eventually, those things that continue to remain hidden eventually came to light, whether you were able to open it up and reveal it, or eventually the issues continue to bubble, that it just begins to overflow out of the closet, overflow out of the chest, overflow the thing that we're trying to contain. It just breaks it and overflows everything, and it just creates a huge mess. So when I think about Nosferatu and some of those themes we can look at, I mean, really, the big theme we could look at, it's all about the relationships and how we can benefit from even sharing some of our most vulnerable, some of the most struggles that we deal with. If we're willing to share that with a trusted community, people who say they love us and actually mean it, that's going to bring a whole lot of healing in our lives. We don't have to deal with the shame of struggling with lust, or struggling with an addiction, or struggling with materialism, or struggling with your finances. Those are things that we as Christians should be open to share those struggles, be open to really try to say, this is what I'm struggling with. Because when we're able to share that, not only there may be some other people maybe struggle with the same thing, and then you kind of have your own niche support group to help each other, to keep each other accountable, to do things. Or maybe there's someone else who may be struggling with something else, and they're more open to share something because you were sharing a vulnerability in your life. And I think once we're able to bring the darkness into light, light will always vanquish the darkness. So hopefully this helps you. I don't get too preachy on the Scott Stedman podcast, but that's kind of the whole point for Film for Thought, is to get a little preachy sometimes. So again, if you have not checked out Nosferatu, please do. I mean, it is a horror movie, so if you don't like violence, there's a little bit of violence in here. Not too much language. So if you're someone who doesn't like foul language, there's not a lot of foul language in here. Like, I don't think any, maybe a couple words, but really there is a lot of sensual, sexual themes. There is a decent amount of nudity. So that's just some things to be aware of. And if that's stuff that bothers you, then, don't worry about watching the film. If you want to, watch the original Marnau 1920s film. You can pretty much watch it anywhere. But yeah, it's a classic. And I would, and for me personally, I would watch that first, and then I would jump to 2024. If you really want to go, you could watch Nosferatu the Vampire. I believe that was directed by Werner Hoggs. I feel like that's incorrect. Hold on. Let me give you the correct let me give you the correct version. That was directed by Werner Herzog. That's right, Werner Herzog. Again, that's another good one too. But really, if you can watch Marnau and then Eggers' take on it, you'll do good, and it saves you some time not watching a third film. But friends, thank you so much for listening to the Scott Stedman podcast. Thank you so much for supporting this. Hopefully you have a good weekend. And if you like this episode, if you like to comment about this episode, you can email us at our website, thescottstedman.com. You can also just comment on wherever you find this video, both on the podcast, YouTube, wherever you're finding us. Just feel free to leave a comment, and we'll read your comments on the air. Thank you so much, and have a good day. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman Podcast. The Scott Stedman Podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman Podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.